Break down the scientific method into some very basic points. This is something that applies to all laboratories, and sociology and anthropology are really social sciences. So we try to develop a way of analyzing a world that is reproducible, that we can show individuals how we came to our conclusions, opposed to maybe art or literature, where we could base things off of feelings and personal experience. We can't necessarily do that in sociology. We have to show people where our information is coming from. So we start off with asking a question. We then look at previous sources, previous forms of scholarship and sociological and demographic scholarship that has been made. Then we formulate a hypothesis, so we make an argument based off of those sources. We design and collect data, and that would be as easy as carrying out interviews. And we draw conclusions based off of those interviews, whether or not the hypothesis is valid or not, and we report the results. Often in sociology, we sort of already know what is happening, and our sociological theory guides us to specific conclusions. Specifically, if we look at things like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, we're already starting off there with a pretty loaded theoretical statement that there is oppression in the world. So we can sort of start there. The question we could ask is, why are people oppressed then? Not the fact that oppression exists, but why or how people are oppressed. There's several different studies, very noteworthy, some that have won Pulitzer Prizes, that look at how segregation in Milwaukee is based off of unfair housing policies. This is nothing historically new or anything that would come to a shock of anyone who's paid attention to politics and civil justice in Milwaukee over the last 100 years. So, hypothesis could then be unfair housing policies cause segregation. That's a very apolitical argument to make, but something tends to happen when we carry out sociological research. We often uncover new aspects or new corners of that question or that hypothesis as we carry out interviews with individuals who are directly affected, as well as conducting research such as surveys and looking at demographic data. So often what we see then are conclusions like this that we have is housing insecurity leads to income insecurity. So we see that people are oppressed and segregated because unfair housing policies that don't allow individuals to invest in neighborhoods, and that causes great deals of disruption, which also cause secondary forms of harm or secondary forms of oppression. Double precarity, some people call it. So housing insecurity leads to income insecurity. That's two forms of oppression that overlap. That's something new that we developed by going through this demographic interview process that we went through, asking the questions and carrying out a very long-term study. So in the process of doing the literature review then, we're going to look at hundreds of years of information. We're going to look at not just empirical evidence, so data collected, things that everybody else can go and collect and view and try to reproduce in their own way. We're also going to look at similar cases around the world. We're going to look at similar cases in Milwaukee. We're going to look at new theoretical approaches that might lend some nuance to the arguments we are trying to make. And this is a process that takes place over a long form of study. You get a PhD often or a master's degree when you really want to do research. I myself took 10 years to get a PhD. I spent 4 years collecting data in a Brazilian shantytown. And then I spent another 3 years writing it up and analyzing the data that I had. And I'm still analyzing it now. So if you wanted to go out and do a long-term research project like that, before I went out in the field, I would wake up every day and I'd read a book or two. On Sundays, I would often go to the library at the University of Colorado where I learned, where I got my PhD. I would read a book before noon. I'd go have lunch. I'd read a book at afternoon, and then I'd go home, ride my bike home, maybe relax a little bit, make a evening cup of coffee, and then read another book. I would just be reading. And I can tell you, it's all useful information. There's nothing that you'd throw out. necessarily. You might not use it all, as we would say, including it into writing, but we would definitely have this broader opinion. We'd have this knowledge, this base of all these different studies that were carried out, all these different opinions on similar things that people conducted. So how do we formulate a hypothesis? We want to separate a hypothesis into two different segments: the independent variable, or the cause, and then the dependent variable, or the effect. So how does gender, as the independent variable, affect income? So gender doesn't change normally. Obviously, we can talk about fluid gender identities and different identity politics and gender norms that are being challenged currently. That is not necessarily the question in this hypothesis. We would assume then that there's a pretty static definition of gender. We have to sort of assume a static definition of gender. This might include male and female, but it also could include other more expansive forms of gender, as long as we defined it and we sort of established a general understanding of what those gender norms are. Okay, so those are relatively static definitions. People don't change their gender identity often. And often, if they do change their gender identity, it's a pretty dramatic and fixed change. So, okay, we have that very independent variable, something that we can't really change. It's the cause of something. So if you have a specific gender identity, what is going to be the effect of that gender identity? What is going to be the effect on income, on your gender identity and your gender performance? And I think we can assume in just very basic terms, this is something that gets repeated in the political sphere a lot, that if you're not a man, you are going to be earning less money. And especially if you are a non-heteronormative, cisgendered person, if you don't fall into those normative categories, those binary categories of man or woman, you're also going to have a very negative effect on the possibility of your income. So we see here a very stable hypothesis. If this is a gender reality, then we can try to argue for a specific set of events. If gender is true, if being a female or being a male is something that we can say is concrete in society, then we can also look and examine what type of effects that would have on someone's income background. We can also have surveys then. Once we start defining those big questions, we often, and we have a literature review, we often go and we try to find a specific group of individuals. We can't just sort of make broad claims about all gender norms, because we do have variation, and not all men are empowered compared to all women. We do have poor men and rich women, and we could say that there's a definite power dynamic in there. And then gender is experienced even within those sort of static binary categories of man and woman. Even being a heterosexual, normative, cis male has many different experiences in this world, not just one singular experience. So we'd have to define a population. That often means looking at a specific set of individuals, a specific community, often geographically or demographically isolated. Then we would go out and try to find a good large sample of those types of individuals. So if we wanted to do research on Milwaukee or Denver or Rio de Janeiro, we can't survey the whole city. That is just logistically very difficult to do. And so we're going to have to define a specific population. I myself had 150 interviews and experiences that I had with individuals that I took detailed notes of. And those individuals were from all different backgrounds and all different forms of political and economic strength and privilege. And I was looking specifically at a general question about how digital technology affected the shantytown. So they were all united. I sampled all those individuals based off of their relationship to digital technology, based off their relationship to either digital activism or digital inclusion programs, which were more or less local workshops for people who didn't have computers, for them to learn how to use computers, to people who were working in cybercrime and things like that. So I had this big net that I was sampling to find these individuals. This was a population that I defined, I imagined, and it was something that people approved of. My advisors and other scientists were able to recognize how I created that population. I was able to explain it to them. So we have that idea of defining a population, finding members of that population, and then we have different tools we can use. I myself often use interviews, principally interviews, but we can also look at other things. We can collect qualitative data, numbers, I should say quantitative data, numbers and figures, things that are measurable, that exist outside of individual opinion and outside of just cultural norms and things like that. So if we look at what income individuals are making based off their gender, that's a very quantitative analysis. You can't really change that number in a very legitimate way. You'd have to break a lot of social rules and cultural rules to say that a number has a different meaning than what it does. So if you make $10,000 a year, you are going to make $10,000 a year. There's no way to interpret that left or right. So, okay, we have this idea of quantitative data that includes stats and figures and census data, more or less. And then we have qualitative data, which includes interviews and experiences and more narrative functions. And when we get into these interviews can take many different forms. They can be very formal. They can be based off of a standard set of questions, which I sometimes do, but I most often just go in and I start talking to an individual about what they do, their experience, their own personal experience, and I talk about not necessarily naming other individuals, but I mention, hey, I've talked to some other individuals that have a very similar job to you, and they believe this. Do you believe that? And so I reproduce the same questions when I talk to individuals. I try to link questions together and have individuals have a conversation with each other through my interviews, even though they're probably never going to meet each other or they're not going to be in the same room while I'm talking to them. So there's many different ways. There's a formal and informal way. There's a highly structured way to do an interview and a very unstructured way. And I tend to do very qualitative, unstructured analysis of my data and collection of my data. So that brings us to a very important part of the sociological research question. We often have to go to a community some way, either physically or by using the internet or by collecting a whole bunch of materials produced by individuals. We have to transport ourselves to a specific place in order to collect and organize our data. I myself went to a Brazilian shantytown, and that was a specific form of field work done by me that is called participant observation. So I go to the field, I participate in daily life and rituals and activities, and I go to the supermarket and people get married and all those kind of things. And I also observe. I also use that as an example to take notes. I'm always sitting there with a notebook and recording data. I'm recording interviews. I'm recording observations. I'm recording my own feelings. I'm recording what people are saying. And most people know. I'm almost always announcing myself and introducing myself. And then if someone doesn't want me to record them or to discuss them, they tell me often, and they're very clear-cut. And or I can also sort of pick up if someone's really uncomfortable with my presence. So that's also called ethnography. So going around trying to collect cultural data, trying to collect interpretations that are based off of cultural norms and cultural understandings based off of everyday practices. And there is also a type of field research called social experiments. I generally do not use this model in any way, shape, or form. Some people do, but it often is an idea of producing a stimuli, a social stimuli, that is able to reveal a variety of results. So, for example, there is a very well-known study called the Stanford Prison Project or Stanford Prison Experiment. And this was more or less a bunch of very privileged Stanford students, so this ultra-elite university, one of the best in the world. A sociologist got them together, sociologist that was in his 30s, late 30s, so he was a relatively young guy, relatively ambitious, and got a bunch of undergraduate students in his class to divide up into groups. Some would be the guards, some would be the prisoners, and they would just regulate each other. And it pretty much turned into chaos because there wasn't a lot of regulation. There wasn't a lot of control by the principal investigator, that professor, in terms of when abuse was taking place, when people were abusing their power as the guard, the fictitious guard or the pretend guard. And it was a very problematic experiment. It showed really how hubris and being overzealous could negatively affect and skew your social experiments. Other people also said later that it was a perfect experiment. The Stanford Prison Project was a perfect experiment to show how toxic masculinity is. Whereas if you give a young man ultimate power and you don't put social control on them, they tend to push that power into a way that could corrupt, that would allow them to concentrate even greater power. That's a hypothesis. I'm not sure if I know is 100% verifiable, but I thought it was a really interesting counter argument that was sort of challenging a lot of these different narratives about whether or not there was an exploitative nature of the Stanford Prison Project. Nonetheless, we see that there's a bunch of different stuff going on here, right? We sort of are either going out and interviewing people, we're taking surveys, we're constructing surveys, we're observing, we're participating, we're trying to record cultural norms and cultural practices, and then we're also sometimes providing a whole bunch of stimulus to a cultural environment, a community setting that is shaping specific responses. This leads to the question of ethics. Often researchers and professors, especially if you have a PhD and you work at a university and you make good money and you can publish people's names and people's life histories and their experiences, you often have a great deal of power and people can abuse that power very easily. So with that, there are a number of ethics that go into place in protecting people who are subjects of sociological research. Research has to always benefit the subject of the research. That has to be a principal goal of the research. In a similar respect, that benefit can never be outweighed by the harm that a social experiment could possibly do. So we have to be very careful about mitigating harm. Some of the populations that are very well protected in terms of institutional rules, we have something called the Institutional Review Board at every university and every school of higher education. That is a board of faculty that are assigned specifically to review the legal and the ethical ramifications of a specific sociological research project. And it also extends to any other form of human subject research, but sociological experiments and sociological observation fall into this institutional review board. Who are specifically covered? We have prisoners. Why are prisoners specially covered? They lack the legal guaranteed right to say no to a research project. They are stripped of their civil rights in many ways. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have necessarily the right to free movement or any of those other rights. They are forced to do so many things that they aren't necessarily easily allowed to say no to an experiment or a research project. You also have children and the elderly. This mostly is related to the fact that children don't necessarily understand the world that well. Obviously, we can look at all the different ways that we teach children and all the ways that we can reflect on our past and how we didn't necessarily get it, right? We also have the elderly, and we know I have a great-grandma, I got a grandma, I got parents. All of them are approaching their later years, and you can tell that there are some things that they are falling behind on. Cultural norms they're falling behind on. Sometimes their health isn't that good, so when their physical health deteriorates, sometimes their mental health changes and deteriorates as well. So the elderly really become a vulnerable population. They can be exploited really easy. So we protect them when we do research as well. People with disabilities, both mental and physical, are also very well protected. There are a number of examples in the Nuremberg trials where there were people in the Holocaust, Jewish populations in the Holocaust, that were victims of the Holocaust, Nazi prosecution, but also they were subject to experiments. And so we see that there is a form of torture happening on people with disabilities, giving people disabilities. People with mental disabilities were often euthanized or sterilized, so they would be unable to have children, and this was done without their will, without their consent, without their explicit consent. Pregnant women are also very much a vulnerable population just because it is a very complicated part of a human experience. Your health is very much on the line, and there's two lives at stake, particularly when a woman is pregnant. Sick people, just in general, if your goal is to help everybody in a research project, you want to make sure that your principal goal is to help sick people. And there's actually a really horrible story of a US funded experiment happening in Tuskegee in the United States. A group of African American men were intentionally infected with syphilis, sexually transmitted disease. They were intentionally infected by a bunch of researchers, not told for 40 years, suffered many health problems as a result. And it was all done for the sake of the research project rather than helping the individuals who are being directly affected. So we can see that sick people can be exploited easily if they're kept sick just for the research project. So I myself, I am a PhD anthropologist. I study anthropology, which is more or less the study of culture or the study of man. It is sort of tangential in sociology, but it is really geared towards this ethnographic method, this form of ethnography that is long-term participant observation, lived and looking at historical realities, how they are enacted every day. And then I look at how people create and assess value, how they develop social relationships based off of shared values, and how that constructs broader ways of knowing and experiencing the world. So it's a subset of sociological research or social scientific research, and it's very much related to the broader definitions of sociology. And often nowadays, if you read sociological research, they will use all these terms besides anthropologist to define themselves. They'll define themselves as an ethnographer doing participant observation and studying lived realities while assessing value and symbols, but they just won't use the term anthropologist. They'll call themselves sociologists. So it's we're cousins, more or less. So what is culture then in terms of anthropology or in terms of sociology? Culture is something that is a little bit different than society. It is a little bit different than how people identify or how individuals are identified in a broader sense. It is a question of what is said and what is expressed versus what is done. So in this sense, we can see that there's a bunch of rules that are put into place in society. We have a great deal of expression that goes on in terms of how society should be ordered, who should have power, should presidents have power over poor people, right? That's sort of like a big question. Should we empower the most marginalized individuals through our democratic process? So that is a really good example of an ideal. Democracy includes a great deal of people and empowers a great deal of people, and that's what's said. But then we see what is done, and we see that there is a whole nebulous form of culture that takes place that really breaks up that surface level, superficial idea of what a society is. So we're looking at beliefs, values, symbols, and then this is sort of a minor theory that we'll not talk too much about this class, but this is a linguistics theory from the linguist Sapir-Whorf, and in this we see that the Sapir-Whorf theory is arguing that there is not only what is signified, but also how it's being signified and what is being signified and the method of it being signified. So we have the signified and the signifier. Think about what a tree is. Think of a tree. Imagine a tree. Look and think of a tree. That's one thing. We also have the word tree that I'm saying right now. You can spell out the word tree, T-R-E-E. Those are distinct from what a tree actually is. And there's a whole great deal of social work and social construction that goes into translating what a tree actually is, to us communicating what a tree is, to what a tree means in our form of cultural value and our cultural existence. We can see that trees are metaphors for a number of things, laying down roots. We can see that there is a historical relevance to trees. People plant trees to have an effect beyond their own lives. And so there's this symbolic notion of what a tree can accomplish in many different ways. It might not be the most profound thing. You might just see a tree as a tree. But nonetheless, we can see that the fact we have words for it, there's a whole bunch of social interaction going on. Me remembering the word tree and translating to you is a very important social act. So then we can see there are a number of different subcultures and countercultures when we talk about language, when we talk about interpretation. Get into this here in these slides. The best definition of culture for an anthropologist comes from E.B. Taylor. He is this old-timey, bearded sociologist, anthropologist. He came up with this definition. Culture, or civilization, taken in its broad ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So we can see that culture is very holistic and interwoven within itself. I would definitely recommend noting that definition down because it will be very useful as we describe culture throughout the course. We have the idea of subculture then and counterculture. We have the idea of community as well. And so these are how people associate, how people see themselves as different. What is an example of a subculture? I would argue that a subculture is the Amish. They're part of the broader American culture. They are definitively part of the United States history and integrated into the United States history, but they are not necessarily a part of the principal culture. What's another example of a subculture? We can see that teaching and universities are a subculture of the broader American culture. Our university culture is not reflective of every aspect of American culture, but it does have its own rules. It is part of that culture. We also have the idea of a counterculture. These are cultures that sort of oppose the norm, that look to challenge dominant ways of knowing. And I have an image of punk rock guy here with a mohawk. This is sort of just some graffiti. We've got the anarchist sign there. Punk rock guys are pretty much, and gals and people are pretty much against the system, right? They are counterculture. They are trying to oppose a dominant set of norms that are problematic for them. We can also go back to the Amish. I would say that they are also opposed to a set of norms that don't apply to them. So we see the idea that the Amish reject a lot of technology, and through that they're rejecting a lot of different cultural norms and cultural standards. So we have a bunch of different ways we can use these terms, but I would say the difference between culture, counterculture, and subculture is culture tends to refer to a more dominant set of practices. So the practices that apply to the broadest sense of people. When we talk about subculture, that is a form of culture within that dominant culture, but it's just more specific and something that is more unique in a specific corner of culture. And society, I could say. And then we have the idea of counterculture, which is opposed to that dominant culture. We do have some cultural universals. I often use this as an example here. We got this old-timey image of a bunch of different couples. What are some things we can extrapolate about culture that we can see? There aren't many cultural universals. We have to really be careful about making too many generalities because not all culture is American culture. Not all culture is culture in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We see that culture can be spread out and has many different variations. But we do see some universals that we can identify and isolate as forms of data. This image is a really good example. We see couples, male and female couples. They are all partnered up. We can see this is most likely reflecting marriage couples. So there's a form of kinship, there's a form of familial tie that is getting created. And then we also see everyone has their unique forms of clothing and garment. And even in societies where clothing is not necessarily a principal commodity, not necessarily something that individuals flaunt or invest too much time in. I'm thinking of Amazonian tribes where they often have very little clothing and they often only have jewelry opposed to these sort of linen garments that we see. But we see that there's some universals being formed. We can also see that there are some objects there. We see that there's a bowl that represents food. So we have different forms of agriculture. We can describe cultivation of food and economic resources is one specific form of analysis. All cultures have economic practices. That is for sure. We also see that there is some guy holding a scroll. Every culture has a way of translating knowledge from generation to generation. It might not be written, but there is definitely a way that we all transmit knowledge from generation to generation. We also have a lot of people with animals, domesticating things that once again goes along with how we conquer our economic and our material world. And we also see a great deal of weapons, which is something that might testify to the way that humans always are trying to negotiate power amongst themselves. What are some reactions to culture? And I say this in a very qualified way. What do I mean by a reaction to culture? What are the different ways that individuals experience culture? What are different ways that individuals try to use culture either for their benefit or for the ways of understanding the world? So we have the idea of cultural relativism. This is the idea that we have to think relatively about a specific culture. This is not something everybody does. This is something that's very important for cultural anthropology as well as for sociology. So what does cultural relativism mean in its basic sense? It means trying to suspend your own cultural judgments and trying to relate your perspective to the perspective of the community that you are studying, trying to see the community based off of its own standards and its own cultural values. This is very difficult because normally we develop a cultural world that is pretty definitive, that culture is pretty shaped, pretty well formed already, that we can't really change culture. Culture might advance, but it doesn't necessarily get broken down. And we also are trained from a very young age that our own nationality, that our own way of seeing the world is correct, and other people have a less correct way of seeing the world. This is something that can be very problematic for a sociological researcher. We want to suspend all our prejudice in order to really try to get a form of knowledge that can be reproducible across individuals. And if we don't suspend our own knowledge, we are not going to be able to reproduce our knowledge across individuals. When we come to that cultural dead end, when we struggle to get over our cultural relativism, we often run into culture shock. We often find a startling form of culture. I can come up with a number of examples, but I will just say, I won't even say what culture I did this in, but I cannot eat chicken feet. And I've been in several situations in several different countries, in several different social settings where people have tried to feed me chicken feet. And I sort of get a gag reflex. And it's edible, it's chicken, I eat chicken, but just the feet was a cultural taboo for me growing up in Wisconsin. I did not eat chicken feet. So that was a form of culture shock. Sometimes we can relate culture shock to other things, such as economic practices, the ways people that are exploited. We can also relate it to marriage practices and other forms of cultural expectation. Often, what happens when people encounter culture shock is that they have an ethnocentric opinion of the world. They see that their world is the best. And this is universally negative. Being ethnocentric is seen as a bad thing in sociology and cultural anthropology. Seeing your own culture as better, as qualitatively better than another culture, means that you are trying to justify a bias. So what we want to do as sociologists and cultural anthropologists is think with cultural relativism and avoid ethnocentricity. Avoid seeing our culture as the best culture in the world. And I have an image here. I really like this image. We see that there are two cultural traditions that are coming to head. We have the American tradition with television and modern culture and skyscrapers and Mickey Mouse and football and cowboys, and it's very bombastic and very dominating. And then we have this image of European culture, which might seem more historical and more reserved and more elegant, right? We have this sort of dynamic going on. And I think what the image is trying to show is that often Americans tend to be ethnocentric and impose our culture on others. This is the product of globalization and cultural diffusion. If you go anywhere in the world, American cultural traditions are very strong, specifically in the corporate and branding aspects. Everyone wears Nikes. I think the Nike swoosh, there's studies about this, the Nike swoosh is more recognizable than the crucifix. For example, the golden arches are more recognizable than the symbol of Jesus Christ, the number one or number two religious figure in the world. So we see that these cultural traditions can travel across the globe and become influential in a variety of different contexts. When you go to China, they're speaking a different language, they have a different set of cultural values in many different ways, but they still are valuing some of those American brands, some of those American styles of living and consumption. We then have the idea of high culture. So this would be more so that European fancy culture. And then we have sort of popular culture, which would be more the Mickey Mouse thing. So we have the idea where you need a lot of investment in order to understand and really appreciate classical music. Anyone can appreciate classical music, but often the people that do are people who have training in some instrument that requires privilege to have that training. You have to have access to that instrument. You have to be able to afford lessons. You have to be able to encourage your children over generations to take music lessons. So that's a very moment of high culture. Then we have popular culture, which is more or less just televisions and things we see on the internet. I think slowly, the popular culture dynamic is going to definitely overwhelm this more exclusive cultural consumption moment, especially in the age of social media, where individuals have access between the rich and the poor so easily, and between these different aspects of society. It's not necessarily going to get rid of difference, but it's definitely going to help align individuals in terms of their cultural perspectives. And then we also have cultural imperialism, which this sign, this image, this picture, once again points to, where the US is trying to be ethnocentric and impose its own ideas and its own cultural values on Europe. Well, there's some elements of culture then, and this goes back to that definitions. We can see values and beliefs. We can see real versus ideal culture, so what is said versus what is done. We can see that there's forms of social control and authority. There's hierarchy. There are roles in the society. Individuals establish roles and rights and privileges, and those are not often shared. We see that there are formal norms, so things that are written down, things that are established, things that are irrefutable. And then there's informal norms, so the ways individuals understand the world and the ways individuals react to the world. Best way we can think of this, the formal norm of not speeding in a car. We all know that is against the rules to speed in the car. And then the informal rule is, you can speed 5 miles above the speed limit. That's an informal norm. that we all break and we all establish and we all sort of can negotiate. We also have the idea of morals, which is something that can be very relativistic. We can see that there is a moral aspect to marriage in many societies. So specific types of marriage, whether that means a polygamous relationship with multiple partners or a monogamous relationship where divorce is not accepted, we see that there's morality there that is getting shared. We also see the idea of theft and the idea of public or personal possession can be shaped throughout society, a different set of morals. If we go to a communist country, obviously we're not going to see many private yachts in a communist country, whereas if we're in a capitalist country, we're going to see a great deal of more private property. And that's a moral value and something that is maintained by those formal norms. We also see that culture is very much based in symbols, and this goes beyond just text, beyond the written language, but also symbols like the Golden Arches or like Jesus Christ. We can analyze those symbols and see all the different meanings and beliefs that they create. And then also, we have to be very careful to see culture as dynamic, as something that's constantly being changed, something that's constantly being adapted, and something that's constantly being played out. There is no one version of any different culture at any different moment in history. We are constantly changing and constantly reacting to each other. So then just going back to the idea of the method of ethnography, we can see that we can analyze specific things as participant observers, as anthropologists going to a place like a shantytown or going to a place like a school or going to a place like a prison or a hospital. We can see that there's specific elements that we can go out and observe and participate in. There's a material culture, a technological culture. Right now you're engaging with me over a computer, and we have our very own unique interaction through this computer dynamic. That's a very technological dynamic that we can talk about. We can also look at pyramids. We can also look at agriculture. We can also look at written technologies. So written vocabulary, the written language is a technology in and of itself. It might not be material, but it is an technology of culture. It is an example of culture. We also have all these ideas of symbols, which, okay, these symbols are digitized and made into a physical manifest, but they're much more important than just them being present on your screen. They are important because they represent specific things. Those shapes represent things, whether or not they are in a physical form or even just how you imagine them in your brain. They are simply non-material, culturally relevant objects. We have the crucifix, we have the Indian swastika, so something that symbolizes peace. We have the yin and the yang, which symbolizes equality. We have the lotus. We have the Hebrew star. We have all of these different symbols that have these very important cultural meanings. If I went around and I damaged any one of those symbols, I would get in very deep trouble. And you have to ask yourself, why is that so important for people? It's pretty much because it is definitive of individual cultures. Then we have beliefs, once again associated with these symbols, religious beliefs, different ways of knowing the world, different structures of thinking. And then we have these other cultural norms. Language, everyone has symbols. They might not be the same symbols, but we all have symbols in our culture. We have values, things that are seen as desirable or undesirable. And then we have norms and taboos. So we have things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. These are all identifiable as you go and participate and observe. These are the kind of things that you would go and note in a ethnographic or anthropological setting. What are some other things that I use as an anthropologist? I use surveys, I use questionnaires, I use interviews, and I use participant observation and ethnography. We use as much tools as we can. We spend a lot of time collecting data, and mostly, like any scientist, we don't give everybody all the data we collect. We give a very nice distilled version of that data. So this week, you're going to be reading a ethnographic description that really goes in and describes collecting ethnographic data and understanding that ethnographic data. You're going to be reading a article called Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Buchanan. She went out to a tribe in the middle of Africa, and she did long-term ethnographic participant observation with that tribe. And one night she was sitting around talking about Shakespeare with the community, with individuals in the community, explaining Hamlet specifically and how Hamlet played out, the different cultural values that were being expressed. And what she found, what Buchanan found, was that the cultural universals that she thought she identified in Shakespeare, this old text, did not necessarily apply to how this other culture saw the world. So what do we see then? We see that there's this idea that Shakespeare has universal meaning. She went out and tested that idea, and she found through conversation that that was not the case, that it refuted the assumption that there are cultural universals, that Shakespeare had universal meaning. One way we can see this, and this is someone who is very important for anthropology, is Clifford Geertz, Geertz. And what he described was the difference between a twitch and a wink. So we're seeing that there can be intentional things being done, that there can be intentional winks that are done, but then often on a surface level, you can have a twitch that doesn't really have much social meaning. So what are we doing then? Interpreting a twitch or a wink? Is that wink intentional? What is that wink trying to convey? How can we explore that wink based off of cultural norms and cultural values? And what kind of conclusions can we make based off of that wink? So a twitch, which is unintentional and often means nothing, compared to a wink, which is almost an identical motion, but means so many more things. How can we understand that basic action in a much more complex cultural context? And we're also going to be watching Milwaukee 53206. Much of this course is going to be about Milwaukee, the Midwest, and my research in Brazil. And what we can see is a dramatic difference from the interpretive model, the way of collecting data that we see in Murder in Milwaukee. And I would note that down, how that is different. In Murder in Milwaukee, we have several examples of sort of grandstanding, seeing Milwaukee as a very violent city, a chaotic city. Whereas in Milwaukee 53206, we still see people talking about crime and violence, but from the perspective of people who are victimized by it, from the perspective of people who are trying to reform themselves and pull themselves out of a criminal environment. And so what we see then is a much more empathetic perspective, one that expresses the voice of the people who are talking, one that seeks to present their ideas in order to benefit them. So we see a much more ethical form of research being done. And I have the link there, but we're going to have a downloaded copy on the platform as well. And then what can we ask is, what are some cultural elements of culture that we see in Murder in Milwaukee and 53206? How can we identify culture? How can we identify these different values and practices? Concluding thoughts then, we're looking at sociology as a social science, how we can develop a set of methods and a set of questions, a hypothesis that is testable, explorable, and that is related to other forms of research. And we also want to be highly critical of those methods and be conscious that there is a variety of cultural realities in this world that don't allow for just one way of seeing the world. We have to see the world in a variety of different ways. A central question that we can ask then is, how do we produce social scientific knowledge? That's a central question to this essay or this lesson. And then what influences our data collection? And these are going to be central questions for the rest of the course. We're talking about a critical pedagogy. We're talking about naming, reflecting, and acting. And we want to be sure to be highly critical